Hey guys, tonight we begin with the Middle Ages. Everyone skips over the awkward parts, the unglamorous parts, the things that were so normal back then. Nobody thought to write them down, which is honestly rude of them. We're diving into medieval life, the real version, not the castle and knight fantasy you probably imagine. Picture this: endless mud, suspicious stares at left-handed people, and the genuine fear that silence means something invisible and unfriendly has moved in. You probably won't survive this emotionally, but your ancestors did. So let's see how they managed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. One of the biggest lies we tell ourselves about medieval people is that they stayed put, born in one village, died in the same bed, never leaving the comforting radius of the local cow. You picture them rooted like trees, generation after generation occupying the same patch of dirt, speaking to the same 7 people their entire lives. In reality, medieval life was less rooted farming community and more permanent state of low-energy relocation. People moved constantly, usually not because they wanted to, but because something had gone horribly wrong. Crops failed, lords raised rents, armies marched through, ate everything, and left behind the medieval equivalent of a sorry about that note written in hoofprints and ash. When this happened, peasants didn't complain. Complaining was dangerous. Complaining meant drawing attention to yourself, and attention from authority figures rarely improved anyone's situation. So instead, they packed. And by packed, I mean they grabbed whatever wasn't nailed down, argued over whether the cooking pot was worth carrying, and walked, not toward opportunity. Opportunity was a concept for people with options. They walked toward, maybe this place is slightly less cursed. Seasonal work added to the chaos. Harvest time pulled laborers across entire regions. You'd leave your village, walk for days, work someone else's fields, collect whatever payment was promised, hopefully not just turnips, and then walk back. Religious festivals triggered mass human migration as thousands of people decided that walking for weeks to stand in a field and pray was a perfectly reasonable vacation plan. Pilgrimages were popular because nothing says spiritual growth like blistered feet and food poisoning from questionable roadside stew. Travel itself was an experience. Roads were mud. Mud was everywhere. In winter, you sank into it, your feet disappearing into cold, sucking earth that released you reluctantly with each step. In summer, you choked on dust that coated your throat and turned your clothes gray. Signposts were rare. Maps were optimistic lies drawn by people who'd never actually been to the places they were illustrating. Getting lost wasn't an accident. It was the default setting. You aimed yourself in a general direction and hoped the road eventually connected to something recognizable. And yet, people kept going because staying could be worse. If your lord suddenly remembered you existed and wanted more taxes, walking away might save your life. Medieval society liked to pretend people were legally bound to land forever, tied by feudal obligations that stretched back generations. Reality quietly disagreed. Villages became revolving doors of humanity. New faces arrived. Old ones vanished. Nobody asked too many questions because tomorrow they might be the ones leaving under cover of darkness with a sack of grain and a growing sense of regret. Even gossip traveled faster than official news. A merchant with loose morals and a loud voice could spread rumors across half a kingdom faster than a royal messenger who actually knew what he was doing. Information moved through human contact, carried by travelers who traded stories like currency. So medieval people weren't static peasants trapped in time. They were tired, mobile survivors, constantly walking away from problems, usually straight into new ones. History draws borders on maps with confident lines. Medieval people walked right over them, slowly, complaining the entire way, following paths worn smooth by generations of feet that refused to stay put. Romance in the medieval world was heartfelt, emotional, and frequently outsourced, because while people were deeply capable of falling in love, most of them were not capable of writing it down. Literacy was rare, expensive, and mostly reserved for clergy, nobles, and that one guy in town who wouldn't stop correcting everyone's Latin pronunciation at the market. So when medieval people wanted to express affection, devotion, or uncontrollable longing, they hired a professional, a scribe, a clerk, sometimes a monk. Nothing kills the mood like whispering your deepest feelings to a man who has sworn celibacy and is judging your grammar while dipping his quill into ink that smells faintly of iron and regret. Picture the scene. You enter a small room that smells like parchment and quiet disappointment. You clear your throat and say something like, "I need a letter, a love letter." The scribe nods calmly, completely unsurprised, and asks, "How intense are we talking?" Then comes the confession. You dictate your feelings out loud, slowly, carefully, while another human being writes down every word with the emotional distance of someone taking grocery notes. You say, "Tell her my heart burns for her." The scribe pauses, looks up, and asks, "Burns as in spiritually, or burns as in you should probably see a physician?" And of course, there were standards. Medieval love letters followed formal structures borrowed from classical texts. There were opening praises comparing your beloved to dawn, roses, or divine light. There were emotional declarations, vows of loyalty, dramatic flourishes. If you weren't eloquent enough, the scribe would help. This wasn't optional. Romance had formatting rules, and violating them suggested you were either ignorant or deliberately rude. Even better, the scribe often knew both parties. Small towns didn't offer anonymity. Your love letter might be written by someone who baptized your crush, taught her cousin to read, and absolutely knew she was already engaged to someone else. Professional discretion was encouraged. Professional silence was hopeful. Sometimes scribes reused phrases, not intentionally, but when you write dozens of love letters a year, patterns happen. Somewhere out there, two medieval lovers received suspiciously similar compliments about their eyes resembling stars reflected in a tranquil pond, and never compared notes. Scholars debate whether this outsourcing made romance less authentic or simply more collaborative. Some argue it democratized emotional expression, allowing even illiterate people to participate in literate culture. Others suggest it created a strange performance where real feelings were filtered through professional language that flattened genuine emotion into acceptable formulas. And then there's delivery. Letters were carried by messengers, friends, or whoever owed you a favor. There was no privacy seal beyond wax and trust. Anyone handling it could read it, laugh, or memorize your romantic desperation for later entertainment at the tavern. Yet somehow, despite all this, medieval love letters worked. People married, affairs happened, hearts were broken, love survived quills, witnesses reused metaphors, and monks with opinions. Now, if romance was complicated, being left-handed was worse. In medieval society, being left-handed wasn't a harmless quirk. It was a red flag, a warning sign, a gentle suggestion from the universe that something about you was fundamentally off. And by off, medieval people meant possibly cursed, morally suspicious, or one bad day away from witchcraft. The problem started with symbolism. The Latin word for left is sinister, which should tell you everything you need to know. Right-handedness was associated with order, righteousness, and divine favor. Left-handedness, meanwhile, was linked to chaos, deception, and doing things the wrong way. Literally, if you reached for something with your left hand, someone nearby probably frowned and quietly reconsidered trusting you with sharp objects. Left-handed children were often corrected early, and by corrected, I mean actively trained out of it. Teachers, parents, and religious figures encouraged right-hand use for writing, eating, praying, and basically existing. If you stubbornly favored your left hand, it wasn't seen as preference. It was seen as defiance, or worse, influence from something that preferred you didn't follow normal human patterns. Even daily rituals reinforced this bias. People crossed themselves with their right hand. Oaths were sworn with the right hand raised. Important actions happened on the right side. Doing something left-handed felt wrong in a way that was both social and spiritual, like wearing your shirt backwards to church. Technically possible, but everyone notices and assumes you've made terrible life choices. Medieval logic concluded that if the devil existed, and everyone agreed he did, he probably favored the left. Left-handed knights had it especially rough. Sword training assumed right-handed combat. A left-handed fighter confused opponents, which sounds like an advantage until you realize your own instructors didn't like it. Being unpredictable was suspicious. Being effective while unpredictable was even worse, because it suggested you'd gained skill through unnatural means. So if you were left-handed in the Middle Ages, congratulations, you weren't evil. You weren't cursed. You were just living in a world deeply offended by your coordination, where love required a middleman, and your dominant hand marked you as spiritually questionable. In the medieval world, self-awareness existed. Self-reflection did not, at least not visually, because for most people, mirrors were rare, expensive, and wildly impractical, which means the average medieval peasant went through life with only a vague, second-hand understanding of what their own face looked like. Glass mirrors were luxury items owned by nobles, monasteries, or that one suspiciously wealthy merchant who never explained where his money came from. Polished metal mirrors existed, but they were small, dull, distorted, and often showed you a version of yourself that looked like it had been lightly cursed. Imagine finally seeing your reflection and realizing you appear permanently annoyed and slightly melted. Not exactly confidence building. For most people, the closest thing to a mirror was water. Ponds, wells, buckets, or rivers offered fleeting glimpses, usually warped by ripples, shadows, or the sudden realization that you might fall in and die. You didn't linger. You glanced. You accepted whatever vague shape stared back and moved on with your day. As a result, medieval people learned what they looked like through descriptions. Other people told them, not kindly, "You have your father's nose. Your eyes are too close together. You look tired." This was your mirror. Social feedback, brutal, unfiltered, and unavoidable. Personal grooming became approximate. Hairstyles were practical, not aesthetic. Beards were trimmed based on feel, not appearance. If your hair looked uneven, someone would eventually mention it loudly, publicly, and with unnecessary enthusiasm. The idea of checking your appearance before leaving the house simply didn't exist. You left the house and hoped for the best. If no one laughed immediately, you assumed things were fine. Confidence was easier when you had no visual proof otherwise. This disconnect between identity and appearance created a strange freedom. Medieval people weren't obsessed with how they looked because they literally couldn't be. Vanity required access. Access required money. Most people had neither. So medieval society judged you by your actions, your reputation, your family, and whether you smelled tolerable, not by your jawline or skin tone. In a world without mirrors, self-esteem was built on survival, not selfies. But while you couldn't see yourself clearly, you could see your possessions. And that's where things got emotionally complicated. One of the strangest and least discussed facts about medieval life is how emotionally attached people were to their stuff. Not in a modern consumerist way. There was no impulse buying, no seasonal upgrades, no treat yourself mentality. When you owned something in the Middle Ages, it was because you needed it, and chances were you would own it for most of your life. Naturally, people started giving these objects names. Tools were the most common candidates. A shovel wasn't just a shovel, it was the shovel, the one that helped you survive winters, dig fields, bury relatives, and occasionally threaten aggressive geese. When something does that much emotional labor, it earns a name. Axes, plows, knives, and even cooking pots were often referred to as if they were coworkers rather than property. Weapons were especially personal. Swords, daggers, and shields frequently had names, sometimes serious, sometimes oddly affectionate. A blade that had protected you in battle wasn't metal. It was a companion. Breaking it wasn't inconvenient. It was tragic. People didn't say, "My sword snapped." They said, "I lost him," with genuine grief in their voices. But it didn't stop there. Ovens were named. Doors were named. Bells were named. If an object was central to daily survival, it crossed the line from tool to personality. An oven that baked good bread was praised aloud. One that failed was insulted loudly, repeatedly, in front of others, as if shame might improve its performance. Scholars debate whether this represents genuine belief in object consciousness or practical psychological coping. Some argue medieval people truly believed tools possessed spirits or awareness. Others suggest it was simply healthier to blame a stubborn door than to scream into the void about your general existential frustration. When your entire life depended on a handful of objects functioning properly, you developed relationships with them. You spoke to them. You blamed them. You thanked them. There was also a legal side. Named objects appeared in wills with startling specificity. I leave my good knife to my eldest son. Not just any knife, the good one. Everyone knew which one that meant. Objects carried memory, reputation, and history. Losing them was losing a piece of identity. Even repairs carried emotional weight. A patched tool wasn't inferior. It was experienced. Scars meant reliability. A tool that had been fixed a dozen times had proven it deserved to stay. Each repair told a story. The winter the handle cracked. The day you dropped it crossing the river. The afternoon you used it to defend yourself from something you'd rather not remember. In a world with very few possessions, each one mattered. So medieval people didn't just own objects. They lived with them, worked with them, and sometimes cursed them like old friends who refused to cooperate. Honestly, naming your shovel makes a lot of sense when your shovel is the reason you're still alive, and you have no mirror to remind you what your own face looks like. In the medieval world, shoes were not fashion. They were not accessories. They were not something you casually owned 3 pairs of, just in case. Shoes were survival equipment, and losing a shoe was less oops and more. This might actually ruin my ear. Leather was expensive. Skilled labor was expensive. Everything involved in making shoes required time, animals, and a cobbler who probably had strong opinions and limited patience. As a result, most people owned exactly 1 pair of shoes. One, and those shoes were expected to endure fields, mud, stones, animal waste, winter frost, summer heat, and whatever mysterious liquids medieval streets offered without explanation. So instead of replacing shoes, people repaired them constantly. Soles were stitched, restitched, patched, layered, and reinforced until the original shoe was less footwear and more historical artifact. A medieval shoe could contain leather from 3 different animals, repairs from multiple decades, and enough stitching to qualify as a textile thesis. Cobblers were everywhere and deeply respected, not glamorous, but essential. A good cobbler could extend the life of a shoe for years, sometimes decades, and if you found one who worked quickly and didn't judge you for the smell, you stayed loyal forever. Shoes were so valuable that they appeared in wills. Parents passed them down to children. Older siblings inherited shoes that had already seen too much. Breaking in new shoes wasn't painful because they were new. It was painful because they were someone else's old ones. And heaven help you if a shoe failed during winter. Bare feet on frozen ground wasn't inconvenient. It was dangerous. Frostbite didn't care about your financial situation, so people wrapped their feet in cloth, straw, or whatever material they could find until the cobbler could work his magic again. This also explains why medieval people walked the way they did, carefully, deliberately. Every step mattered. You didn't sprint unless chased by something worse than losing a shoe. You avoided puddles not for cleanliness, but for shoe preservation. In a world without cheap replacements, durability was everything. Shoes weren't discarded. They were managed, loved, maintained, argued with. So when you picture medieval life, remember this. Those worn out, misshapen shoes weren't signs of poverty. They were signs of responsibility. If your shoes lasted, you were doing something right. But even with good shoes and reliable tools, one quiet fear haunted medieval life more than war, famine, or disease: being forgotten, not dying. Dying was expected, being erased. That was unbearable. In a world with no photographs, no recordings, and very little written documentation, memory was fragile. If no one remembered you, it was as if you had never existed, and medieval people were deeply uncomfortable with that idea. Eternity was long, reputation was short, the math didn't work. This is why people obsessed over names. Children were named after parents, grandparents, saints, and occasionally that one uncle everyone agreed deserved another shot at existence. Naming wasn't creative. It was archival. You weren't honoring someone. You were keeping them alive through repetition. Gravestones, when they existed, mattered enormously. Even the simplest marker, a carved symbol, a scratched name, a rough cross, was a declaration. I was here. I mattered enough to be remembered. If you couldn't afford stone, memory had to do the work instead. Stories became tombstones you carried in your head, repeated until they wore smooth like pebbles in a stream. This fear also explains why medieval people loved witnesses. Contracts were spoken aloud in groups. Promises were made publicly. Events were announced where crowds could hear. If enough people saw something happen, it became real. If no one saw it, it might as well have never happened. Privacy wasn't romantic. It was risky. Church records existed partly for the same reason. Baptisms, marriages, deaths, all carefully logged, not just for God, but for memory. Being written down meant permanence. Being unwritten meant vanishing quietly into the mud of history. Your existence compressed into nothing, as if you'd never drawn breath at all. Some scholars argue this obsession with memory shaped medieval culture more than religion or feudalism. The drive to be remembered influenced art, architecture, and social behavior. Even the humblest peasant understood that legacy wasn't about wealth. It was about being spoken of after death. Even medieval charity had a memory angle. Donating to a church often came with one request: say my name in your prayers. That wasn't spiritual vanity. That was insurance. As long as someone spoke your name, you weren't gone. Your existence continued in sound, in ritual, in the mouths of strangers who would never meet you, but would keep you alive nonetheless. Ironically, this obsession worked. Centuries later, we still know the names of ordinary people because they were stubborn enough to leave marks, records, symbols, or stories behind. So medieval people didn't chase fame, they chased remembrance. They lived knowing their time was short, their world was unstable, and history was forgetful. And they fought that reality the only way they could, by making sure someone, somewhere, remembered their name, which is why you're hearing about them now. In the quiet darkness, as their names travel forward through time on nothing but breath and determination. In the modern world, silence is marketed as a luxury. People buy noise-canceling headphones, book silent retreats, and proudly announce that they just need some quiet. Medieval people, on the other hand, heard silence and immediately assumed something had gone terribly, spiritually wrong. A silent medieval house was not peaceful. It was suspicious. Noise meant life. Talking, coughing, praying, animals, shuffling, tools clanking. These were reassuring sounds. If a home went quiet, it suggested illness, death, or the presence of something that preferred you not notice it. And medieval people were very uncomfortable with things that preferred not to be noticed. This fear had religious roots. Silence was associated with the grave, the afterlife, and the unknown. Churches echoed on purpose, filling space with chanting, bells, and prayer. Bells rang constantly for timekeeping, warnings, celebrations, funerals, emergencies, and sometimes just because someone thought the silence was getting ideas. Homes followed the same logic. People talked while they worked. They sang while they cooked. They prayed out loud. Even alone, many people muttered to themselves, not because they were strange, but because being audibly present felt safer. Silence implied abandonment. Sound implied protection. At night, silence was especially dangerous. Darkness already belonged to spirits, demons, and theological anxiety. Add silence, and you had a perfect environment for imagining footsteps, whispers, or divine judgment creeping up behind you. A crackling fire, even a weak one, was comforting not just for warmth, but for sound. That gentle noise reassured you that the world was still functioning, that nothing had stopped while you weren't paying attention. This also explains medieval group sleeping habits. People didn't just sleep together for warmth. They slept together because shared breathing, shifting, and occasional snoring created a soundscape that pushed back the void. A room full of noise meant no one had died quietly during the night, which was always a concern when medicine was guesswork and illness arrived without warning. Even monasteries, famous for silence, structured it carefully. Silence wasn't absence of sound. It was regulated, ritualized, and heavily supervised. Unplanned silence, though, that was unsettling. To medieval ears, silence wasn't calm. It wasn't healing. It wasn't restful. It was a warning. So if medieval people seemed loud, repetitive, or annoyingly chatty, remember they weren't filling space. They were keeping it away, pushing back against the quiet that suggested something had ended or was about to. And then there was hair. In medieval society, hair wasn't just hair. It was a statement, a warning, a resume, and occasionally a problem that needed immediate spiritual intervention. What grew out of your head mattered far more than modern people would be comfortable with, because medieval culture believed hair carried meaning, moral, social, and sometimes supernatural. Long hair could signal power, freedom, or rebellion. It could also signal that you hadn't been properly punished yet. Knights wore their hair with intention. Nobles styled it to display status. Monks shaved it to prove devotion. And women's hair? That was treated like a dangerous substance best kept under control at all times. Loose hair on a woman was associated with sexuality, disorder, or emotional instability. Respectable women covered their hair, not because it was cold, but because medieval society was deeply nervous about what might happen if it wasn't restrained. Hair escaping a veil was treated like a scandal in progress, visible proof that proper order had slipped. Hair cutting itself was symbolic. Having your hair cut against your will was a punishment, a public removal of dignity. Criminals, prisoners, and disgraced individuals often had their hair shaved to mark shame. It wasn't just humiliation, it was identity theft. You didn't look like yourself anymore, and everyone knew why. Religious life took hair seriously too. Monks shaved the crown of the head in the famous tonsure, creating a bald circle that silently announced, "I belong to God now." This haircut required maintenance, which meant monks were constantly reshaving the same awkward bald spot, just in case God was checking. Even beards carried meaning. A beard could symbolize wisdom, masculinity, or authority. Shaving one off could be an insult, a challenge, or an emotional declaration. Medieval men didn't shave casually. They shaved with intent. And then there was the fear of hair falling into the wrong hands. Hair could be used in charms, curses, or folk magic. People believed strands carried part of your essence. Losing hair wasn't cosmetic. It was risky. Throwing it away carelessly was an invitation for someone with bad intentions and too much free time to work something unpleasant against you. Some scholars debate whether these beliefs about hair reflect genuine superstition or social control mechanisms. Hair regulations may have been less about magic and more about maintaining visible hierarchy, making sure everyone could identify social status at a glance. So medieval people guarded their hair, controlled it, shaped it, and judged others by it relentlessly. Hair wasn't decoration. It wasn't personal expression. It was power sitting on your scalp, daring you to manage it correctly. And if you didn't, someone would definitely have an opinion, probably voiced loudly in a space that was never, ever silent. And so we reach the end of tonight's journey through medieval life. The world you've wandered through tonight was messy, suspicious, and deeply strange, but it was also human. People loved, feared, traveled, and survived with whatever tools they had, literal and otherwise. They named their shovels, feared silence, and walked endlessly towards something slightly better. Their shoes fell apart. Their hair meant too much, and they desperately wanted to be remembered, which is why we're still talking about them now, centuries later. In the quiet hours, when the world slows down, let their stories carry you gently into sleep. Rest well.